U.S. President Joe Biden's administration has announced support for a global waiver on patent protections for COVID-19 vaccines. This has offered hope to poor nations that have struggled to access the life-saving doses. South Africa, as well as India, have been calling for the World Trade Organization to suspend intellectual property rights related to COVID-19 to allow poorer countries access to the vaccine, medicines and other new technologies needed to control the pandemic. To help us understand what the U.S.'s support means, I'm joined by Fatima Hassan, Health Justice Initiative founder. Good to have you with us once again, Fatima. Perhaps let's paint the global picture about vaccine inequity. Over 3.2 million people around the world have died due to COVID-19. Vaccine inequity is a buzz, a phrase right now. But how huge is the gap between the haves and the have-nots?
Thanks. So the deficit is massive. I mean, of the 700 million doses of vaccines that have been administered in the world, 80% have gone to people in richer parts of the world, and only 0.2%, so that's, less than even 1%, has gone to people in the global south. I mean, even if you look at the situation in our own country. So the situation is quite dire and it's quite desperate, and I think that's why the announcement by the Biden administration last night is quite significant, and in certain cases it's also quite historic.
So talk to us about the significance of America's support for this waiver.
So up until now, for the last 8 months, there's been a handful of nations that have been blocking the TRIPS waiver, a proposal that was put forward by the South African Indian government as far back as October 2020 already. And so these nations had basically been blocking the ability of the negotiations to continue. And last night's announcement basically paves the way for the next phase of this process. The U.S. government announcing that it would support the temporary suspension of intellectual property protections relating to vaccines only, so not all COVID-19 related technologies, means that the process will now involve going to text-based negotiations at the WTO. What is obviously going to be interesting to watch over the next few days is whether the EU, whether the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, Canada, Norway, Switzerland, the other countries that have been blocking the waiver up until now, will also go down the path of the US or will continue to actually block the waiver. And the waiver is significant because if you lift intellectual property protections and you suspend that, it doesn't just relate to patents, it relates to copyrights, industrial designs, trade secrets, etc., which would enable, one would hope, the explicit cooperation of the sharing of knowledge and the vaccine know-how. And if you can transfer the technology in a speedy manner and if you can resolve these negotiations expeditiously, you potentially could make a dent in the access disparity situation that we're facing now.
The NDA agreements were a seminal and key part of the negotiation processes between governments as well as pharmaceuticals. How does this then bear on those existing NDAs? Does this then mean an amendment, an addendum to such?
Well, look, I mean, those are contractual negotiations, and, we've long been calling for the NDAs to be lifted because it really relates to a lot of elements around commercial secrecy. But certainly, I think the push by the Biden administration to ask for greater cooperation of the pharmaceutical companies, to ask for a relaxation of the intellectual property regime, means that there is definitely a shift in power. Obviously, the industry issued its own statement last night, the pharmaceutical industry, indicating that it was opposing the Biden administration, that it didn't support this particular move. So a lot of, I think, in the next few weeks will become more clearer as to, what is the future of NDAs, what is the future of vaccine injury schemes, for example, that have been set up to provide full indemnity to some of these vaccine manufacturers. I think the most significant thing, however, is that there's finally a window that's been opened on the possibility of actually scaling up manufacturing in many parts of the world to ramp up production so that we don't face the scarcity that we're currently facing.
On a day-to-day elementary level, should this actually pass and the waiver is indeed lifted, what does it mean for South Africa? What does it mean for India? What does it mean for other poorer countries around the world as far as how they are going to now be able to manufacture the vaccines? If you could give us an ABC of that process.
So in an ideal scenario, the negotiations would be very quick, they would be very speedy, they wouldn't be adversarial. You would have a text or a resolution or a declaration issued emanating from that. It would set out the framework for how the manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines would take place in the current context and how certain elements of the intellectual property framework would be managed. So you basically would have a situation where if a manufacturer or if existing manufacturing capacity exists, if they come forward and say, well, if you share the recipe with me, if you share the know-how with me, I'm able to produce X million doses of vaccine. So it opens up the field and it takes away the monopoly protections and rights without any kind of fear of patent infringement or intellectual property liability, without the potential for litigation or even trade pressure. So it evens out in a way the playing field, and it means that more manufacturers can actually enter the field to be able to scale up. I mean, obviously the statement is very narrow from the US government. It only relates to COVID-19 vaccines. You'll remember that the waiver proposal by South Africa and India had also talked about diagnostic and other forms of treatment, so testing kits as well. So, yeah, a lot will be determined, I think, in the next few weeks and months in relation to those negotiations. What we don't want is a long, drawn-out negotiation. If it takes another 8 months, then, you know, basically the Biden statement will only be worth the paper that it was written on.
When you look at this issue from the pharmaceuticals perspective, they are not in support of the lifting of any of the waivers. They want to maintain their intellectual property and maintain their patents. Could there be a negotiation as far as maybe licensing is concerned, that pharmaceuticals continue to benefit financially from the inventions that they've come up with? In our market chat today, we're seeing already the markets reacting with shares and stocks dropping for the likes of Pfizer.
Yeah, look, in some cases, those market prices have rebounded already because I think people were just uncertain exactly, you know, what the statement meant. I think the second thing that we need to just address is whose invention was it, whose knowledge was it, who bore the risk of the accelerated vaccine research. And in many cases, public funding and public support through public institutions and public scientists actually contributed towards the vaccine research. So there's a bit of a misnomer about whose invention was it, whose intellectual property was it. But be that as it may, I think the issue is, you know, there's going to have to be a reckoning with the pharmaceutical industry. The way in which we treat the issue of medicines as a commodity has to be addressed. And I think this is, you know, a partial opening of that discussion and that conversation. And of course, the industry is not going to be happy because they won't have an exclusive monopoly. But the situation that we're in, even with a temporary waiver, does not mean that the intellectual property would be suspended permanently. It also doesn't mean that they would lose money necessarily, because they would still be able to earn royalties on all of those licensing deals. So I think your question is also correct in respect of, you know, when companies see that this is what the U.S. government, is, you know, quite a significant economic powerhouse in the world, is taking this step, they may actually decide to offer more voluntary licenses. We certainly saw that in the HIV/AIDS crisis. So there's a lot of movement, and I think there's a lot that will still be sort of, you know, develop over the next few weeks as well.
Well, thank you very much for that insight and that update, Fatima Hassan. There's certainly a positive development for countries and such as ourselves and continents such as ours, including India and the rest of the third world. Thank you very much for your update there. That's Fatima Hassan, Health Justice Initiative founder.